Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeff Gedmin. I'm President, CEO of Middle East Broadcasting Networks. This is the first in a series of digital salons convened by MBN. Tonight, we have fabulous guests and a conversation about the shape of next Iran. Thanks to the MBN team, Ala, Marwan, Ringo, our editor-in-chief, Leila Bazi, Matt Kaminsky, our editorial chair, and thank you, Sid Lipset, who took the lead in organizing this conversation today, this evening. I don't know of anybody more creative than Sid in getting the right people together at the right time on the right subject. And it is really a big moment right now in the Middle East. We have with us Roya Hakakian, the human rights advocate, poet, essayist, and book author. We have Elliott Abrams, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, who has held numerous posts in the U.S. government at the highest level, White House, State Department, Iran, Venezuela, and Andres Ilves, who has led BBC Persian, who has led RFERL Persian, and right now for our MBN, tracks Iran across the Arab, Middle East, and North Africa. I'm going to jump in. We're going to take questions in chat, and here we go. Boy, it really is... it's just, it's unbelievable, this big moment in the Middle East. You called me, Roya, on Saturday morning. You apologized that you were calling me early, and there's no apology necessary. And the first thing you said to me was, it's unbelievable. They're dancing in bomb shelters in Israel. They're dancing in bomb shelters in Iran. As someone who has lived outside of Iran for many years, could you say a word about the moment? Because it's a pretty remarkable moment.
I just have to correct something about what you said. They were dancing in bomb shelters in Israel, but Iran never built any bomb shelters for Iranians. Iranians were dancing on the streets and celebrating the death of Ayatollah Khamenei. I think I think the dancing um, says everything anyone needs to understand about the hostilities between Israel and Iran. That it wasn't a hostility that the nations experienced towards each other, but the hostility that basically the regime in Tehran has been exercising towards Israel. And I think that really captures, and I wonder if this has ever happened throughout history where the two people who are supposedly at war with each other are really not at war at all, and they are celebrating the death of the same enemy.
You wrote a quick piece and a wonderful piece for the Free Press over the weekend. And I won't get the title perfect, but it was in essence, the best chance for peace is this war. Could you tell us about the argument you advanced in that piece?
Yes. So I thought it was quite um, uh, upsetting and a complete shame that suddenly, between the statements that the State Department, Marco Rubio, and the president were making about why they needed to go to war with Iran, seemed to be at odds with each other. And there seemed to be a lack of clarity as to why this war needed to happen and right now. Because to me, the reason should have really transcended any administration, the Trump administration, a Democratic, a Republican, and it should have been a very simple reason. Within the span of 3 days, January 8th, 9th, and 10th, the Iranian regime killed the same amount, if not much, much more than the Serbs killed in Srebrenica within the span of several months. And that was enough for President Clinton to decide to enter, to declare, an emergency on in Serbia, in Bosnia, and enter the fray and start bombings. And to my mind, it was very clear that a regime as dangerous as the regime in Tehran needed to hear very loudly and very clearly that it was unacceptable to treat its own population the way it has done, um, and that it should not have been imagined by them that they could go without any retribution or accountability. So whatever else that we seem in America to be wrapped up in, was the threat imminent, and was it coming tomorrow, and whether was it nukes or missiles? To me, the massacre, the historic massacre that they carried out, was enough and should have been the reason why we entered this war.
Elliott, I'd like to turn to you and get you into the conversation this time. A little bit later, let's talk about the multiple motives or objectives for the war. But Elliott, you've written, you also wrote over the weekend about Iran in National Review. You also wrote a few weeks ago, somewhat parallel, about Venezuela. I'll get to the somewhat parallel in a moment. What I want to ask you about is the piece this weekend over National Review, where, if I can capture it probably simplistically, crudely in a sentence, you are careful to say that the formal end of the regime may be days, weeks, months, years away. But I read the argument as the Islamic Republic is over, and it is, as a threat through its proxies and terror networks, no longer what it was. We're doing, or we're seeing done, irreparable harm. Is that correct?
Yeah, maybe a short way of putting it is we argue about regime change, by which we mean the absolute end of this regime. But even if in some sense it survives, the regime is changed. It's immensely weaker now. No Navy, no nuclear program. By the end of this, no missile program. The Israelis are hitting the means of internal repression. It is a country whose neighbors now, I'm going to strike that because of what Roya said, and she's right. It's not a country. It is a regime whose neighbors now hate it, including Oman and Qatar, which were trying to sort of present themselves as neutrals, and for their troubles have been attacked by the regime. So it's a very different situation. And it's going to be a different regime. Obviously, it's going to have a different supreme leader and different military leaders and Revolutionary Guard leaders, because the old leaders are dead.
Then I want to go back to the piece you wrote for National Review a few weeks ago about Venezuela. And I confess I didn't get to reread it today. That's my fault. But as I recall, you applauded the removal of a dreadful authoritarian leader, but you expressed concern about what was coming in his place. And I want to hear a little bit from you about Iran right now. What's next, what we as the United States ought to be supporting, and what the market will bear, what's most realistic.
The Venezuela model works for Venezuela. That's not to say I support it, but the model seems to be you decapitate the regime and thereby, in a sense, terrorize the others in the regime who are left and say, here are our demands, and you will meet all of them. And in the Venezuela case, the immediate demands have to do with things like oil and foreign policy. That is to say, Cubans out, Iranian regime people, Revolutionary Guard people out. What about a transition from the remnants of the regime to democracy? The administration Trump administration seems to have decided a one-day transition cannot be performed. So we'll leave a power structure there in the interest of stability, and tell them, okay, you need to start releasing political prisoners. You need at some point to have an election. The reason that I am critical of that is I think it should be much faster if you're going to do it that way. That is, we should be right now saying, wait a minute, that was January 3rd. It's 2 months. There should not be one political prisoner. Why have we not set the date for an election? In that case, the Venezuela case, you might, there's a great deal of difference from Iran. Just on the Venezuela case, that's what the administration is doing. Negotiate with the remnants of the old regime. And if you listen to Secretary Rubio, push it toward a transition in a year and a half, presumably an election, not this year, but next year. And what I would want to see now, again, more American pressure, more change now, and a negotiation between the regime and the political parties and the political leaders. And there are many, because in the very recent past, they've had elections in Venezuela. So you can point to, for example, Maria Corina Machado, Edmundo Gonzalez, as wildly popular individuals. And we know from poll after poll after poll that if Machado runs in the next presidential election, she'll get 80% of the vote or more. Now, in Iran, there is no clarity to how the administration sees the political future. There is a danger, and I know a lot of people, including me, wonder about this danger. Could there be a deal between the United States and the regime? That is to say, the next supreme leader, the new leaders of the Revolutionary Guard, Ministry of Intelligence, that would, in essence, leave them in place if they agree to the U.S. demands, which would, for example, be abandon the nuclear program completely, abandon the ballistic missile program completely, abandon support for the proxies, Hezbollah, Houthis, Shia militias in Iraq, Hamas. Those are very important goals for the United States. The problem with such a deal would be, of course, that it would constitute an abandonment of the Iranian people, and by lifting sanctions in return for those concessions on the part of the regime, it would strengthen the regime and lengthen its life. If the regime does not agree to those demands, or if the United States simply decides those people can't be trusted, whatever they say, then there has to be some kind of effort to replace the regime. And I don't want to talk too long, so I'll just ask one question, or put one question on the table. Suppose in a week or 2 or 3 or 5, there are mass demonstrations in Iran. War's over. Mass demonstrations, as in January. And the regime starts killing people, as in January. Can the United States really sit by and watch that happen?
So we're going to come back to all that. I want to get Andres in. I'm going to put one question back to you. I can't resist, Elliott. Then picking up from one thing you said, what happens then if the regime in a new form decides for a tactical retreat? And they say just what you suggested, enough, let's end the hostilities, we'll sit down and we'll make a deal. Is that something that the United States can resist?
The United States at that point would probably not be able to resist talking. When the president feels we've weakened the regime enough, my fear is that we would not add additional items to the discussion. And the additional item would be, when is the election? When are the prisoners being released? When are people going to be able to speak freely? When does political space open? That would make the negotiation obviously harder for the regime. The problem is, though, that if the United States agrees to, okay, we won't, no more nukes, no more missiles. Again, we are strengthening the regime, we're lengthening its life, and there is no possibility that it will not return to those activities as soon as it thinks it can get away with them, and it will have the money to do them once sanctions are lifted.
Thank you. Let me turn to Andres, get him in, and then we'll widen the conversation. We have a number of questions in chat. We're going to get to those too. Andres, you are a Farsi speaker. You are an Iran expert. You led BBC Persian, RFL Persian. But for us, from Middle East Broadcasting Networks, you have a different remit. You're tracking Iran across the Arab Middle East, North Africa. You should plug or ask one of your colleagues to put a link to your newsletter in Arabic and English every Thursday, the Iran briefing. That's important. But say a word about what you heard from Roya and Elliott, and it's now conventional wisdom. The Iranian regime has done a very good job of uniting Arabs against them by striking them. Would you say a word about what that looks like, and how long is that sustainable, that unity, if Iran continues to try to create chaos, create instability, strike this or that hotel? It's sustainable now. Is it sustainable over time?
Thanks, Jeff, and it's certainly an honor to be here with you, Roya and Elliott. I'd say the following. Some years ago, I managed to get into Iran, despite my career at Radio Free Europe and BBC Persian and so on. And walking around the streets of Tehran, I realized what a disconnect there was between the regime and its own people. All you had to do was elevate your chin by about, 10, 20 degrees and look up, and you have these huge posters of these very angry looking old men with very impressive beards. And then you look down at street level, and it's full of people who are decades younger and represent basically the diversity of human life. And so before I talk briefly about the Iranian regime against its foreign enemies, I'd say that the Iranian regime has been at war with its own people for almost 50 years now. Because let's start with the basics. This is a country like any country that's at least half women, if not a bit more than half women. It's basically been at war with its own women for 47 years. It's a regime, it's a country that has tremendous diversity. A lot of people who don't follow Iran per se, I think it's somewhat known, but it has many, many people of different ethnic groups. It has Kurds, of course, and Azeris and Baluch, and there's an Arab population and other groups as well. They're not really represented. I mean, you can find them, but basically, a lot of other regimes at least engaged in dressing up the fact. I mean, the Soviet Union would have these sort of titular national people. I'm Estonian, so you'd have an Estonian who nonetheless was a good sort of apparatchik for the Soviet state. This regime never even tried. And I think one of the things is that this is a regime that then is having already basically been at war with its own people, keeping down its own people for all these decades. Now it's inviting, it is quite striking that they've managed to launch all these attacks on their nearest neighbors. And then what? Part of the sort of operating philosophy appears to have been simply to create chaos. And that out of that chaos in their near abroad with their neighbors, or their, a couple of countries over, in the case of Lebanon, Yemen, and so on, just basically stir up enough trouble, and it's going to keep the neighbors, their different regimes, and basically busy. And that's not going to be sustainable, because ultimately, this regime, if it does stay, I do think it's in its death throes. It's going to have real trouble keeping a lid on its own population, while then trying to keep raining missiles and whatever else they have and are planning to use to attack their enemies, and then invite essentially their nearest Arab neighbors, perhaps other Arab countries as well, to step forth and engage in quite a bit of retribution. And then you have basically this IRGC, petro-state mafia trying to cling to power against foreign powers raining missiles back at them, and their own people banging at the gates. I think it's going to be a really interesting time. I don't think that they can sustain that for long.
Roya, let's turn the conversation to what's next. And
before you ask,
sure, please.
Can I just say something? Because I think both Andres and Elliott said very important things. And I think the issue of referendum has been one of the demands of Iran's internal opposition, in addition to the external opposition. That for nearly 20 years, Mousavi, who lost the elections supposedly, but really didn't, to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, has been asking for a national referendum on and several other very renowned opposition leaders inside Iran, and even reformists have been calling for a national referendum to say, do we want to keep this this republic an Islamic republic, yes or no? And the reason this makes sense is because 50 years ago in May of, or 47 years ago in May of 1979, the Islamic Republic was not an Islamic republic then, and it put to referendum nationally, Islamic Republic, yes or no. And over 95% of Iranians said yes. So after 48 years, the people are demanding to test this again. So if there are any negotiations going on or will go on with Iran soon, I hope that the least that the administration can add to the list of its demands is holding a national referendum, yes or no. It's been 50 years, everything, every contract and agreement needs a renewal, and it's time to revisit this. And the other thing that I think is really important to mention is that, Iranians were being criticized by a lot of experts and pundits in the West, including in the United States, for the nature of the protests that were going on prior to January of 2026. They were saying that the reason these protests can't be relied upon or taken seriously is because they're mostly the youth of Iran. They're university students, they're young women. You can't have a real change as long as you don't have all the other classes, ages, ethnicities joining in. And what's really significant about last January, and the protests of January is that everybody joined in. You had the youth, you had the elderly, you had the poor, you had the rich, you had members or people who had been active in the woman life freedom movement. You had people who are clearly monarchists and are demanding the return of Reza Pahlavi. But all of these people were on the streets together. And that's precisely the formula for a revolution. So I do think that what happened in Iran in January was a watershed moment, not just for Iran. I think it could have been a watershed moment. It still can be a watershed moment for the whole region. And I think the fact that we've gone back to the discussion of nukes and missiles and completely overlooking the amazing shift that occurred in Iran then is just wrong.
Thank you. Elliott, is this a military operation and transaction to eliminate a threat? Or do we have concern about governance going forward? The president talks about freedom, but freedom is not democracy. Freedom is, release from the tyranny, but it doesn't tell us what should come next or what we're apt to support.
Well, the purpose of the effort was not internal to Iran. It was not to liberate the people of Iran. It was, according to the president and others in the administration, narrower security issues, nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, the Iranian Navy, above all. And I think the question here is whether the administration, whether the president thinks that a deal can be done on those issues with the people of the regime who are left, or does he and do others in the administration come to the view that these are the people who brought you all of these problems. They can't solve these problems. They are the problem. It is their views of Iran, of Shia Islam, of their neighbors, that have actually created the Iran we see today. And therefore, for stability in the region, they have to go. Even if your goal is stability rather than liberty, these people have to go because they are incapable of bringing stability. They will only, they may wait a few years now. Maybe they wait 3 years until Trump is gone, but they will try again. And I don't think we know yet, sitting here today, what view the president will arrive at in the end. I mean, one variable is, of course, what does he hear from Tehran? Who is sending messages? People from the Ministry of Intelligence, people from the Revolutionary Guard, the new supreme leader when he's chosen. Who are these people? How reliable are their messages? What can they deliver? I would just make one more comment on that, and that is, there will be a new supreme leader. Is he actually going to be able to say, I got here yesterday and today I'm giving all of this up? Just whatever the Americans demand, that's fine. That is more or less what happened in Venezuela. It's a very different case. There is no role, for example, for religion in that case. But I really wonder whether a new supreme leader can do what Khomeini did on the Iran-Iraq war, or what Khamenei maybe could have done had he wanted to do, because of his legitimacy, not in the country, but within their closed system in the regime. Somebody new really do that? I'm dubious.
Elliott, could you speak to or speculate for us what the President of the United States is hearing from Bibi Netanyahu about after the war, what next?
I think that what he is hearing from Netanyahu is that there needs to be regime change. That is, that this group of murderers will only continue to murder. And their continuation of power cannot be permitted. So we just have to keep going a bit further. And it is interesting that as of now, day 5, the Israelis are hitting hard at the mechanisms of repression, in the hope, I think, the Iranians will be better able to overthrow the regime and to govern themselves. I think that is what Netanyahu is saying to the president. He's going to hear other things from others. He's going to hear, call it off. 1 week is enough. I'm not sure, and this will matter, what he is now hearing from Mohammed bin Zayed, Mohammed bin Salman. The regime thought, let's attack our Arab neighbors and they will go pleading to Washington, to Trump, stop it all now. That does not seem to be happening. It seems more likely, I think, that those leaders are saying, we got to get rid of these people.
Thank you, Anders. We're going to come back to you in a moment. I wanted to go to Roya for a minute and go beyond your point, Roya, about a referendum. What do you see as most likely? What do you see as most desirable? And if you're advising the administration, what do you want to see going forward to support a transition to decent, accountable government in Iran?
Okay, I'll give you 2 scenarios. One is my dream, and then one is my reality. My dream is to see a democratic Iran. I want to see Iran fulfill what it tried and has been trying to do since the middle of the 19th century. A constitutional movement began in Iran in the late 1800s, and prior to that, there was an Enlightenment movement that began in Iran that has been very important in creating the underpinnings for a society that can cultivate a democratic culture, a democratic society. So my dream is to see this 150-year-long journey to come to its end. But in reality, I hear from President Trump that he's looking for some character from inside the country because he's afraid to repeat what occurred in Iraq, by returning somebody from exile into the country or so on. I think one of the best things that can happen in the interim is for a national referendum to be held, and for the regime to see that it was not able and will not be able to carry out what the Chinese carried out in Tiananmen in 1989, because that was their intention after the savagery that they carried out in January. So let's not have. Let's prove to them. Let's show them that we stand by the people. Yes, let's take care of the nukes and the missiles and everything, but lifting the sanctions from Iran is to give them exactly what they say they have relied upon with the American administrations for the last 5 administrations, which is we always wait the Americans out because every 4 years somebody new comes in and we're always here. And so they know that they can agree to whatever terms America imposes on them, or start negotiating and just drag on the negotiations until they get to the next administration. And then they can restart negotiations and revisit the terms. So I think rather than doing that, let's force Iran into a national referendum, which has been what everybody has been calling for. And let's see whether the people still choose to have an Islamic Republic.
Well, thank you. Andres, we have in chat a question from Nathaniel Greenberg who asks about American public diplomacy. What does the United States want to do to communicate to the people of Iran right now? What can one do through information policy to hasten the demise of the regime and support the democracy movement?
Everyone here on this panel knows, and some of us have worked in international broadcasting. The number one thing missing is information for people in those countries to understand what's going on. So for Iran, it's understanding what's going on in their own country. For us at MBN, it's for people in the Arab world to understand what's going on in their region. And of course, in this case, what's going on in Iran. And it's hard to kind of separate because of all the noise that's out there. We live clearly in an era when everybody has multiple choices, dozens, hundreds, thousands perhaps of choices on the internet and satellite television and other platforms and podcasts and media and so on, that somebody needs to kind of cut through it. And part of the public diplomacy, especially because of the volume of noise that is directed at the West, and speaking specifically about the Arabic language media, that there need to be resources where people can just kind of tune in and go, okay, so this is what's going on, not presented with tendentious vocabulary and adjective filled, this is great, that's bad, this is terrible, and so on, but simply trying to convey the facts as much as possible. And that's, I'd say, one of the key elements of any country's public diplomacy, and especially historically, as someone I worked in the British international sort of broadcasting, and of course at Radio Free Europe and here at MBN as well, is to kind of offer perspectives, strip out the adjectives, show without filters and without loads of calumny and so on, in any direction, just basically represent policies, and then people can make their own choices, make their own decisions, and arrive at their own conclusions. And that's something that I think is missing, and I'd say that is a key element of the public diplomacy. I mean, speaking just about the broadcasting part of it, it is crucial, it is key, and people can't make informed choices without that. There used to be this phrase that was in vogue called surrogate broadcasting, and the premise of that is basically providing people the information that they can't otherwise get, and that they would get if they had if they had unfettered access to information. And I'd say, in terms of certainly what we're trying to do at MBN, is to offer that platform. Click, tune in, watch, listen, get the information, and then, so for example, if somebody's piling on sort of invective about the West, well, tune into MBN, watch one of our videos, social media, check out our website, and go, oh, well, okay, they say that, but there appear to be other ways to look at it as well. And I think that's the best thing we can do.
Andrew, thank you. I want to take Aaron Cohen in chat and direct his question to Elliott and Roya. And Aaron's question, starting with you, Elliott, is: there isn't a narrative being advanced that in shorthand, Bibi persuaded Trump. The question Aaron is posing is, if the war drags on and there are casualties, are you concerned about a blowback against the Jewish community in the United States?
First, I would just say we all hope and pray there are no more casualties. I think the people who are accusing Israel or the Jews of dragging the United States into another war would have done that no matter what happened. They would have done that no matter who was the prime minister of Israel. They would have done that no matter who was the president of the United States or what the facts were. They have a view of the world, and everything has to fit within that. I don't think that's going to that interpretation is going to spread. For one thing, an awful lot of Americans know enough about Iran to know that this regime has been fighting the United States since 1979, has killed hundreds and hundreds of Americans and maimed and injured many thousands more. And more will find out about that, younger people who may not know that. I do think, by the way, just listening to Andres, I do think one thing we're missing is a speech to the American people by the president. He has made these 2 Truth Social videos, 8 minutes, 6 minutes, but he hasn't done that kind of serious Oval Office 30-minute explanation of what we're doing and why. I wish he would do that. So this fits within the context of a wave of anti-Semitism that has been growing since the Gaza war began on October 7th, 2023. And it will be put in that context. But I'm inclined to think you've got to be there already to say Israel did it or the Jews did it.
Thank you, Roy. Could you jump in on that? And I cannot resist where Elliott left off. We had pretty significant protests over Gaza. I don't know that we had protests over the slaughter of Iranians.
Which is, in a way, the best answer to your question, and I'm going to explain why. First of all, as Elliott said, anti-Semitism has been on the rise in the United States long before even October 7th. So none of the people who are making these arguments needed any excuse to spew whatever invective or further, anti-Semitic statements based on facts. However, I think something else that has not been yet made clear is why Iran is a danger to the United States. Because for a lot of people, the events of 1979 are a distant memory. The Khobar towers are either unknown or have just disappeared from public knowledge. And even those aside, even what Iran has done over the years to our troops in Iraq, in other parts of the region aside, an important case about why Iran is a danger to Americans today has yet to be made really clearly. And maybe that's for us to do. Maybe that's future articles that we write or debates that we carry out. But I want to go back to the point you made. The students on university campuses in the United States at times were seen waving Hezbollah flags. That, to me, I became a refugee because people in my country became followers of Hezbollah, and that country became unstable. So I took refuge in the United States. And the last thing I or any one of us who have come from those countries into the United States seeking refuge want to see is those flags and those slogans all over again. So, the ideological power that Ayatollah Khamenei lacked at home, the allure that he had certainly has lost among at least 80% of Iranians, and certainly among the youth of Iran, seems to have a different audience in the West now. And that's only a small fraction of why I am concerned about the influence of Iran. Aside from that, prior to the nabbing of Maduro, one of the most terrifying things I heard from a lot of people who were visiting Venezuela was that they were saying the best Iranian restaurants they've ever eaten at were in Caracas. So what does that mean? That means that members of IRGC and other officials in the government in Iran are taking their misbegotten monies and resources and planting them in various businesses, especially in Latin America, because they want to have a base on this continent, because they want to actually, the 20% that's still loyal to the regime wants to still see a day that death does come to America.
Roya, and then Andres and Elliott. I'm going to pick on Elliott first. Tara M. in chat asks about regime change. We're going back to the shape of the next Iran and transition. And Tara asks, what do you think of the contention that we don't have plans, that we're not sketching scenarios, we're not thinking about where we do or where we may not have influence to facilitate positive political change in the country? Or is there scenario planning going on and we just aren't aware of it? Should there be? What should that look like?
Well, we are unaware of it, certainly. And there's a problem with making those plans, which is it's not our country. I mean, those plans should really be made by Iranians. So you need to be careful about, having a detailed plan for how Iran is going to be run. We're not going to occupy Iran. This is not a case like Germany or Japan after the Second World War, or Iraq or Afghanistan. Now, is there a plan? Unclear. We know that the military made elaborate plans for this attack. We know that they've had plans for a very long time for the possibility of taking out the Iranian nuclear program, for example. Whether there is a plan now, we just don't know. I'm dubious about it, I would have to say. I think people are at State and CIA probably right now trying to figure out who do we talk to? What do we do? We're doing that. The Israelis are doing that. Obviously, Iranians above all are doing that. Maybe some of the neighbors are. And I think the president is going to be torn here between a desire to get a government that he really likes and a desire not to be involved in his great bugaboo, nation building.
Roya and Andres, Reza Pahlavi has plans. The MEK, the People's Mujahideen, have plans. Who has what plans that are tenable, that have popular support and make sense to you, Roya?
My first answer is, well, I think the Mujahideen are a dangerous group. And so I never want to see the Mujahideen come to power in any shape or form in Iran. Reza Pahlavi does have plans, and let's put all that and others before the nation and see, let the best man win. I think here's something that's very important to remember. In 1997, Iranians elected a reformist president. That was the beginning of a reform era in Iran, and Mohammad Khatami came to power. And by the way, he came to power in Iran in 1997 because of the international pressure that had been placed upon Iran as a result of the verdict that came out of the Mykonos trials in Germany. And it led to the European Union cutting ties with Iran. So Iran was forced into putting forth a nicer, more agreeable face to the international community. This moment is not exactly similar to the 1997 moment, but Iran is nonetheless pressed in far bigger ways. And Iran has learned in the past that there are times that it needs to relent, as it relented in 1997. But the more important thing to remember is when they relented, even just for 2 years, and reform really came to Iran in some minor ways, there were a lot of publications, a lot of social, political groups that came into being. The society renewed itself. So at the moment, I think, the best chance that we can provide the people of Iran is to create an opening so that the internet doesn't get shut off when the regime decides that it doesn't want the people to connect to each other or the world outside. All I'm hoping for is is that some opening for even a brief time will surprise us by the amount of plans that may well exist in Iran. I know of a group that has been involved in drafting a new constitution for Iran, and I'm sure there are other efforts that we're not aware of and that we'll learn. So let's just hope that this amount of pressure that's being placed on Iran and part of whatever negotiations that are taking place will provide Iranians with time to re-experience what they experienced in 1997, to breathe, to be able to really come out and exercise their rights, and then may the best man win. Whoever has the best plan, let him or her run the country.
Right, thank you. Anders, you're invited to weigh in on the subject of political opposition and political change.
Yeah, I mean, I echo both Roya and Elliott's sentiments. Just to state the obvious, it's going to have to come from within. I mean, it's certainly, we've all seen emigre politics for different nationalities and countries, different agendas, even well-intentioned ones. And in the end, they kind of, if you look at Europe in the 1990s or 80s and 90s, and there were ranges of people, including bringing back the monarchy to Serbia and Bulgaria and so on. And there are going to be all sorts of proposals. In the end, it's going to come from within. Clearly, the regime has the ability to decapitate, if you will, any emerging leaders, and they've done that very successfully, either by eliminating them or putting them in prison to languish. But these people are going to come out, and I do imagine that very quickly people are going to be, there's one of the fascinating things about Iran is that it has this vibrant culture that's just been suppressed. I mean, it's a country of deep culture and history and literature and thinking, and it continues to exist underground. As soon as there's an opening, as Roya said, like in the late 90s, it's going to come to the surface. If there's an opening to do it with political change as well, not just on a cultural and level, then we're going to see a flowering, and people are going to emerge who may have been, some of the survivors of the massacres of January 8th and 9th, or people who haven't even gotten going yet and suddenly emerge. I think of Lech Wałęsa climbing the fence, back in the 80s. Anything can happen, and I certainly share the hope that it's going to be something good, where one of the voices that hasn't been allowed to come forth is going to suddenly be able to be one of the most prominent voices and end up perhaps leading the country.
Thank you. Elliott.
Let me just jump in for a second. One of the variables here is, will anything come from within the regime about change? In the Soviet case, there was change from within with Gorbachev. And when he started to make those changes, we all found that many people inside the regime, in the KGB, for example, were in it for the money. They had no belief in communism. That's a question I would ask about the Basij, for example. How many of them are there for a salary, and how many of them are deep believers that, protesters have to be repressed and killed? I'd even say that about the Revolutionary Guards. What percentage of them are deep believers, and what percentage of them are in it for the salaries, the power, but would be willing to see certain changes as long as their own status was protected? So there are. If we look at certainly at the Soviet model, it raises questions about what is actually going on inside the regime, and I don't think we know.
So, Elliott, I don't think we know either. So, speculate, please. The Revolutionary Guard. I read estimates that there are between 150 and 190,000 members. They are deeply enmeshed in multiple sectors of the economy. So let's stipulate for a moment that many are in it for the money. How do they become incentivized to back off, back down, and keep their weapons and their other resources out of play in these weeks and months ahead?
In every case where a dictatorship has ended, I was going to except Iran. But if you think of the post-Soviet states, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, if you think of the South American dictatorships, if you think of South Africa, there was transitional justice. Iran is different because when the Ayatollah Khomeini came in, he was not interested in transitional justice. He was interested in killing his enemies and taking power fully. But it is more common to have some kind of transitional justice system. And I mention it because one of the things that could be offered to people who were complicit in this current regime is some kind of amnesty, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that tells them, well, you can't have the money, but you won't necessarily be executed. You won't necessarily be in prison for the rest of your life. That can be important. Secondly, this regime has ruined the economy of Iran. Look at it. The value of the currency is down 99% under this regime. So one of the things that is being offered is prosperity, which can be very widely shared. Iran is a case, actually like Venezuela, where there is a great national resource, oil, gas. There is absolutely no reason in the world, except this regime, that there is such widespread poverty in Iran. So that's another thing you're offering people, a chance to build on their connections and make a new life for themselves. All of this is going to be very difficult. And one of the questions that will arise is, who has the guns? Who will defend if there is a new political structure, a free political structure? Who will defend it against remnants of the old regime? And that, again, raises the question, what's going on in the minds of people in the Artesh, the army, not the Revolutionary Guard army, the regular army, and the police? Are they ideologues committed to the Ayatollah? Or are they people patriots getting a paycheck who would be very happy not to be told, go out and shoot innocent protesters? If there are more uprisings now, with the regime in the shape it is, maybe we will see more defections from the security forces.
I have in chat Michael Allen, who wants to know, do we know something about the Iran Freedom Congress apparently meeting in London later this month? Open mic, one of you, any of you? Then I have a second question. I'm going to pose this to Roya. Roya, you mentioned in passing the Mykonos trial. This is a regime that has undertaken acts of terrorism for decades around the world. I think it's fair to say that there is a playbook, Jewish Israeli targets, dissidents, U.S. officials, and then, of course, also the Gulf. So for the Gulf 2011 in Washington, D.C., the Iranians planned to kill the Saudi ambassador in Cafe Milano in Prospect Street in Georgetown. 2022, there was a plot to kill former National Security Advisor John Bolton. In the 1990s, you wrote a book about a case called Mykonos. That was in Berlin, I know Berlin because I lived there, in Pragerstrasse, in Wilmersdorf, a pretty popular Greek restaurant where 4 Kurdish politicians, oppositionists, were assassinated. 1, you're invited to plug your book. But 2, I wanted to ask you, Elliott and Andres, how concerned are you that a dying regime, still perhaps with some resource, will try to carry out terrorist attacks abroad to divide public opinion and weaken resolve? Roya, you have the microphone first.
Okay. Well, thank you for plugging my book, so we can get on. There's a point that I want to make about this whole issue of, are these people fighting because they have ideological attachments, or are they just paid mercenaries? And I would like to venture a guess by saying that I think the overwhelming majority of them are just, doing it for the pay and not ideology. And the reason is that social media has been the bane of the existence of the clergy as far as the selling of their ideology is concerned. Because everything that they preach at home, immediately we see that their family members in Europe, in the United States, and abroad are acting against. So, Shamkhani, who was one of the top generals of IRGC, married his daughter off somewhere, I think in Europe or Canada, and she was not veiled, and she, was nothing about that ceremony matched any of the Islamic virtues that any clerics dictate to Iranians to abide by. So, and not to mention the outrageous corruption, financial corruption, that people have come to learn about. We know that Moshtaba Khamenei has about $1 billion worth of real estate property and other financial assets in Europe and other parts of the world. And Moshtaba Khomeini, didn't, I don't know, he didn't invent Apple or Macintosh or anything that could have brought him that much money. So people, even their own, guards and Basijis are aware that this is a corrupt class of people who have squandered all the national resources in the country. Now, your question was, Sarah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that this regime has successfully done is someone, while I was writing my book, said, he was one of my witnesses, and a term he used has always stuck with me. He said, they do truck diplomacy. And what he meant by truck diplomacy was that, they get some large vehicle and they just run someone, whether it's an opposition member or anybody that they don't like, run them over and kill them that way in an accident. And then, the Europeans or the Americans or whoever else will be forced to negotiate with them. So this has been an effective means of bringing Europeans and Westerners to their knees. The most recent example was that one of the former guards at Evin prison was brought to trial in Stockholm 2 years ago. He received life in prison, and all his victims who had converged on the court from around the world were rejoicing that finally they got some justice. Since 1988, they had been waiting for a moment like that. And then sure enough, within the span of a few weeks, Iranians nabbed a bunch of Swedish officials in Tehran, and he was swapped for those officials. So I think there is a way that the world has to put its foot down, hopefully through the acts that Israel and the United States are carrying out, and say enough is enough. And belligerence will not get you anything anymore. And therefore, they will hopefully either reform themselves or be completely out of power. I prefer the latter.
Right, thank you. Elliott, I was about to ask you a question about a column by Bill Galston in the Wall Street Journal. And now there in chat is Bill Galston posing his own question. But I'm gonna ask my question anyway, and then I'll give voice to Bill's question. Bill noted in his column in the Journal this week that war is tricky, it brings surprises, and it's particularly difficult when the president has failed to enlist full and proper support from the Congress and the American public. I want to go back to my question about security. I'm riffing off Bill's column. Were there an act of terrorism under present circumstances? Would this strengthen American resolve, or would it erode support for the president and the operation?
I think if you go back to 9/11 or the Arab oil embargo, my thought is that would infuriate Americans and create more support for getting rid of the regime. I think we all fear terrorism on the part of the regime, but they're probably less able to do it now. I mean, than they were a week ago, because the regime is in kind of shambles now. And they used to do a lot of terrorism via Hezbollah, which is also much weaker and more disorganized than it has been in many years. One pattern we've seen in the last couple of years for Iran is they've actually been unwilling or unable to spend the time training their own Iranian agents to commit acts of terrorism in Europe, and have tended to rely on criminal gangs, which suggests, I think, a kind of weakness on their part And with Iran in the state that it is now, I think it's even less likely that such gangs will be willing to say, yeah, sure, let's work with the Iranians. They're a powerful regime. So it's something we need to worry about. I'm confident that police and the FBI around the country are battening down the hatches. But I do think that if it happens, the regime will pay the price.
We're staying with you, Elliott, because Bill has an actual question of his own. And his question is about regime change and air power. And would there not be a need for ground forces when one considers that the Revolutionary Guard and the Siege are extremely well armed? I'm paraphrasing, by the way, all these questions. I'm not reading them verbatim.
Well, it's a very good question, of course. And many people are making this point that you can't do regime change from the air. One answer would be, will the regime crack at some point? A piece of the army, one post, one brigade, or the police refuse to follow orders to shoot. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way is that there may be people on the ground who are willing to shoot back. That's a question for the president and for the Israelis. That is, do we wish to arm people? There are rumors printed in the press today, an old-fashioned expression, printed in the press, but visible online, that there are Kurdish groups from Iraqi Kurdistan who are willing to help Iranian Kurds and fight for them or arm them to fight for themselves. So I think, Bill, that the president's not going to put American troops on the ground in the sense that we did in Iraq or Afghanistan. There's going to be no expeditionary army going to Iran. I could see commando groups. I could see small, either CIA or special forces going into various places. And I could see the United States or Israel, or even conceivably some of Iran's now very angry neighbors, deciding to arm groups inside the country. But while I actually had a piece in the Free Press today suggesting that the president has suspended some of his own rules, like the rule that you never fight for more than one day, as in Soleimani or Midnight Hammer. You announce it when it's over. That rule is gone. You never do anything that is likely to bring American casualties. That rule is gone. But I think the rule about sending thousands of American troops to fight overseas is not gone.
Roya and Andres, Elliott mentioned the Kurds, and it's an important piece of this puzzle. We haven't talked about the Kurds yet. If I have it right, Azeris make up a rather significant part of the population, north of 25%. But the Kurds, less, 14%, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, have been politically very well organized and influential and might well have a role to play in any transition forthcoming. Roya, you first. Could you say something about the Kurdish piece of this puzzle?
It's concerning to Iranians and I suppose, I'm sure, to the Turks, the neighbors of Iranians, to think that armed Kurdish groups are going to fight inside Iran, because the first thing that occurs to the minds of all people who hear this, especially patriotic Iranians, myself is included among them, is civil war and the fear of Iran falling apart as a unified country. However, I think the there could be an upside to this if the diaspora, Reza Pahlavi and others, oppositions who are coming together, including this group that you just announced a little while back, that has convened in London, they can seize this moment and invite the Kurds to join their coalition as leaders of the opposition. The problem has always been, especially from the Kurdish perspective, that they have been the targets of the regime far beyond their numbers, and they have sacrificed far beyond any other group. And not to mention that the entire woman life freedom of 2022 formed as a result of the killing of a Kurdish girl in Iran. So Mahsa Amini was a girl who was visiting from Iranian Kurdistan in Tehran. So the Kurds have offered so much, and in return, the Iranian opposition has always kept them at arm's length, accusing them of being separatists. This to me seems like the prime moment when the opposition can seize the opportunity, invite them to the table, let them be part of the leadership of whatever transition they're working towards, and focus on toppling the regime and building a democracy, and then worry about everything else later. Because if anybody, if this group can accomplish one, if not two of those things, then I think you don't need to worry about civil war and separatism. Because if Iran has a democracy, the incentives for separation or infighting will simply dissipate.
So, Andres, we have 14 minutes to go, you all, and now we dig deeper and the clock is running. Andres, you've spent a lot of time on opposition issues, the minority issues, and the Kurdish question. Could you speak to what Roya just put on the table? Why not bring the Kurds into the opposition in a unified effort to hasten the demise of the regime?
100%. And building on what Roya said, and I'm glad that she talked about, there's Mahsa Amini, whose Kurdish name is Mahsa Jina Amini, and that does make a difference, that it's easy to kind of think of her and ignore her Kurdish identity and the woman who died at the hands of the authorities for allegedly incorrectly wearing her hijab. I think that this is a chance for everyone to be bigger than what they are used to perhaps in the past. And that's a perfect example. So the current Iranian state, separate from the Islamic Republic, was basically quite clearly created to be a unified, unitary state without hints of federalism or anything like it. This is a chance for the people who are going to build a new Iran to invite, as Roya said, people to the table whose voices have not been heard and who have borne the brunt of a lot of the abuse and cruelty from the regime simply for not fitting certain norms. I mean, the Kurds are also, for the most part, Sunni, and that's an issue in itself. How does a pluralistic Iran deal with people who are not ethnically Persian? How does it deal with people who are not Shia Muslims? All of these questions, I mean, they can be best resolved by with everyone having a seat at the table and not ruling out perhaps an Iran that looks different, that doesn't just have a different type of structure politically and ideologically, or without an ideology, but that also acknowledges that perhaps the way that different peoples around the country, where of course that includes the Baluch, for example, and other peoples, perhaps should have a different way of being heard. And I leave it at that because, there are different types of structures and states and, federal and all these things. The risk, of course, is of drowning out people before they even have a chance to be heard. And this is going to be the opportunity for people to be heard, for different languages to be heard, for, and a lot of what we don't know a lot. This regime does not indicate ethnicity in any way, but it's a keen issue, not always in a political sense, but people don't necessarily sit around talking Persian to each other. In parts of Iran, they speak Azeri, something very close to Turkish. What's that going to look like? And this is a chance it's not necessarily a unitary state versus breaking up, separatism and breaking up into different states and so on, which could happen, but it's not a binary choice. And I think people's willingness to understand that there are different ways of expressing autonomy, language, and so on, all need to be given a chance to be expressed in a future Iran.
So Andres said something really important, that there is this fear of Iran dissolving or fragmenting, but those are fears that the regime has been fanning for decades. In fact, the regime has often said to the public in so many ways that, if we are not here, the Taliban would come in and, the country will go to the dogs. And so if you don't like us, that's okay. At least we're keeping you safe and whole. So I think part of this is really the propaganda that the regime has put out. The other is to remember that we all pay a great deal of lip service talking about the great civilization of Persia. Well, the great civilization of Persia is a national identity. These groups have all identified as Iranians, in addition to whatever else they have been and are. And so that makes Iran vastly different from Iraq or Syria or its neighboring countries. And they have had the very wonderful exercise of being a nation working for whatever goals together. In fact, during the Mahsa Amini protests, one of the things that was staggering was that people in Baluchistan were putting slogans on the walls saying, "Mahsa Amini, we remember you. We are here for our Kurdish brothers and sisters." So when push has come to shove, Iranians have stood together regardless of ethnicity. And I would like to say that we can rely on that civilizational history and memory and dismiss a lot of these fears as the regime's propaganda and be done.
Well, thank you. If you can read in chat, I'm going to bring to your attention that Bill Galston may have a bit of a different view on the Kurdish question. I'm leaving that aside for a moment. I'm going back to you, Elliott. Leah Silvert has a following question about the Revolutionary Guard. Again, I paraphrase. Forgive me if I distort something in shortening the essence of the question. There's a new government in Iran, but the Revolutionary Guard doesn't give up. And they're entrenched and they have this vast wealth. Would this not mean that the new government has to contend with this formidable organized crime syndicate? How to confront it? How to dismantle it?
Yes, it will have to. If you assume the best, that is, you assume that Iranians vote for a new system, for a republic, for a democracy, there will no doubt be corruption trials, but there'll be plenty of money, billions and billions of dollars that were stolen over time. The estimate in today's papers is that Moshtaba Khamenei, the son of the late supreme leader, has control over about $1 billion. Yes, that's going to be true, and it is true in every case, really, of a transition to democracy. It's going to be true in Venezuela. It was certainly true in Russia. It's certainly true in Eastern Europe, where you see many people involved in politics whose background is that they made gigantic fortunes in the immediate post-Soviet period. So, yes, it's going to be a challenge. I mean, I suppose you could say there was one famous for it, Velvet Revolution, the Czechs. It's not so common. And if you look at many of the places, certainly in Latin America, years later, trials are still going on with accusations against people who were involved in crimes under the old regime. And the people involved in an organization like the KGB or the Revolutionary Guard know each other. They have a network. and they try to help and protect each other. It's going to take time. That is, after a transition to democracy, they will be a threat to democracy. It's going to take time, and it's going to take some very courageous investigators and police officials and prosecutors. I mean, it's been 47 years, and it isn't going to disappear. Iranians are going to have to build, strengthen, fight for democracy for many years to eliminate the crimes and patterns and behaviors of this regime.
Roya, do you want to speak to that? Any part of that?
It was perfectly formulated. I won't touch it.
I'm looking at the clock. I'm inviting final thoughts. Andres?
I think it's the final days. I'm trying to not let hope creep in there, but nothing will be the same no matter how this war ends or when. There is no doubt. And I tend to think it's not going to be a situation of the U.S. negotiating with, a new supreme leader and a bit of a change. Nothing will ever be the same. And I do believe that the people of Iran will be emboldened as they were at the end of December and in January before they were brutally massacred. This is a regime it's bankrupt and devoid of ethics or morals. And, to the earlier question of what they're willing to do abroad, there's no limit to what they're willing to do to their own people. But having said that, I don't think that a tiny mafia can rule over 90 million people in perpetuity. I think that its final days have come.
Andres, thank you. Elliott, final comment?
I think it's clearer now than it's ever been that this regime, which the Iranian people never wanted and never chose, who wanted democracy and modernization, has brought nothing but 47 years of ruin to the country. And I don't know if Iranians are going to bring it down tomorrow or 6 months from tomorrow or a year from tomorrow, but I think this war will have shortened the life of the regime. And when it falls, we will look back and say that was the turning point.
Thank you. Roya?
By saying that I really do hope and urge the US Congress and all of our politicians to not turn the issue of Iran into a partisan topic. Because there are fortunately plenty of other issues that we can disagree upon and be divided over as a country, but the issue of Iran shouldn't be among them. There needed to be an intervention as a result of the historic massacre that took place in Iran, unlike anything else that Iranians have known, and I think the region has known, in such a short span of time. And it needed to be confronted, and this ought and the Iranian regime, whether Americans remember or not, has been a menace to us, to the region, to the security of our societies at large for the last 47 years. And we have tried all manners of carrots and sticks, and nothing has really worked. So this was essential. So let's not allow this war to become part of the partisan politics or whatever else that's going on in Washington, and speak in a united form against Iran and stand with the administration to see this to its successful end.
Roya, I think that was pitch perfect, and that should be the last word. To the guests, thank you. To the Middle East Broadcasting Network's team, thank you. Roya, Elliott, Andres, what a very, very helpful conversation. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.